I don't know. What did you preach about this week?
Is that how we start?
That is how we start now. It's 11 o'clock, whether we're ready or not. I really want to make sure that we're on time for the live stream so that we don't fail the 3 people that watch the live stream. I heard it was
5.
Yeah.
Because there's a couple of different mechanisms that you can watch.
Yeah.
And now we've got this video of 10,000 people. 100,000 people that was made years ago.
Yeah.
Lurking around. Who knows? Who knows who's here now?
We're world famous.
Listening to our delightful ramblings and...
or not so delightful, depending on the wiring.
It's take it or leave it.
That's right. There's stuff here on the show for everyone. If you want serious stuff, it's there. You just have to wait through hours of nonsense to find it. And then if you want fun stuff, there's that aplenty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm tired.
Huh.
Maybe I'm like preemptively tired. Have you ever done that? Where you like psych yourself up that like this is going to be a long day?
Yeah.
And therefore like you enter tired?
No.
That's never happened to you?
I don't think that's happened to me.
Really?
No.
I don't know. I'm like... I start my seminary semester today.
Oh, yeah.
And so right after this, I get to go and sit in a chair for 3 more hours talking theology, which is...
But you love that.
It's actually delightful, but like my Tuesdays, similar to you, my Tuesdays and my Thursdays are heavy meeting days, which I love. But I'm realizing maybe it's just an age thing. Like I'm realizing the amount of focus it takes to like engage at a deep level.
Yeah.
Meeting upon meeting upon meeting upon meeting.
Mm-hmm.
You want to bring your best self to all those meetings. By the end of the day, I'm like, hey, what's my name?
Wait, so you've decided you're not going to bring your best self to this one?
No.
So you can bring it to later.
Are you kidding me? I'm slouched. I'm kicked back. I'm not bringing my best self to this one. No, actually, I kind of have to. Actually, this almost takes the most focus out of most of the meetings.
But you do, because you do all the like...
Because I have to try and find the thread in all the random.
The random stuff. Well, here's the thing. This week, the sermon was on solitude and silence.
We should just sit inside.
We should just sit here and say to everyone, go practice solitude.
How long do you think it would take before they'd shut off the podcast?
I don't know. So anyway, well, there is lots to talk about.
That was like shockingly uncomfortable when you're anticipating someone. I'm fine for those who are watching the video.
Yeah.
But if you were like on the podcast, you're like, oh, the podcast broke.
They're gone. They've gone. Anyway, there is lots to talk about though, because solitude and silence is fascinating on so many levels beyond what I shared in preaching. So we could talk all day about, we could somewhat ironically talk all day about solitude and silence together.
But wait. You told me that was not the subject matter you were teaching on.
I did?
Yeah. You told me you were teaching on silence and solitude.
No. I said I was twisting it to solitude and silence. I usually say silence and solitude. But I was like, I'm going to talk about solitude first, because that feels like a little, there is like I'm sure a Venn diagram of solitude and silence and some overlap of them.
Yeah.
I guess in theory, you can be silent in a community of people, but also you could be in solitude and not really enter into silence on a spiritual sense anyway. Your mind could still be bouncing all over the place between like, all these different things. I guess in theory, you could be in solitude somewhere with a cell phone, like reading sports news or...
Yeah. Scrolling a social media or something.
And so I think it's both. Both were there for a reason.
Yes.
But like, so solitude's interesting because solitude's had its like advocates probably outside the church, at least in literature, for longer than it's had them inside the church.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, like Jack London and stuff like that, and Thoreau and these guys that were like the ascetics of the early 20th century that are like, young man, solitude. Get out. I just mean in like the modern Western literature. Like, sure, there's been ancient texts
I was like, what about the early church or the desert fathers?
But they're not like current writers, right? So like in terms of like this last like shift in modernity and maybe post-modernity, like late Christendom and post-Christendom, there's definitely these secular writers that are like, oh, young man, get out into the wild and spend time just lost in the beauty of creation and come back transformed. Have you ever watched or read Into the Wild?
There's a movie, right?
There's a movie and a book. So the book is by...
I feel like I've watched the movie.
I'm blanking on the name. It'll come back to me. And then the movie was made like a few years later, and so it's about this young guy, Christopher McCandless, who's like, he's brilliant. He's socially engaging. He's smart. He's driven. Like he's at Emory University and he's writing papers on like apartheid history in South Africa and like all these different like niche subjects. Yeah, and he's just killing it. And so much so that his dad is pretty rich. His dad was one of the early like propulsionary rocket people that sold their design to NASA. And his dad's like, I'm going to buy you a new Cadillac. And he's like, I have a Nissan Datsun that runs great. Why would I want a Cadillac? Don't you even know me? And his dad's like, I'm going to pay for you to go to Harvard. How much have you got in your account for like school? And he's like $24,780 or whatever. And the dad's like, well, I'm going to pay for you for Harvard. And so they leave that dinner together and they never see him again. He just disappears. Like they find out he gave $24,000, and this is in the 80s, he gave $24,000. John Krakauer is the author. He gave $24,000 to Oxfam. He took his car, like had the US mail, like hold all his mail and forward it months later so his parents wouldn't even know where he was. And he just disappears. And he dots his way all the way around America, like working in grain factories and like meeting all these guys that become like soulmates to him. And then he just heads up to Alaska. And he goes to like, he even jokes about like there's Alaska and there's Alaska, way up in the Yukon territories.
Yeah.
And he goes up there with no real experience, some boots. He's been reading Jack London. He's been reading Thoreau. He's been reading these guys that just are like have this soul for solitude, that just want that space.
Yeah.
And he's just following them. Now he ends up like tragic. He has no skills. He ends up dying there. The river, the thaw comes in, the rivers melt, the ice caps melt. And suddenly the streams he walked across that came up to his knees are now like these raging torrents. And he's so insistent on this solitude, doesn't take a map with him or anything. So it's this like weird tragic quest that began with what to him was just this beautiful, noble idea of, I just want to be alone in the beauty of this. So what you're saying is more, it's less that this predated Christianity. It's more that like there is a semi-recent resurgence in the secular space. Well, I think so. I think like
because the Desert Fathers predate all of them.
Well, they do, but so the interesting thing I think a lot of us forget about Christianity is this is maybe a new shift where from a preacher you're hearing like, oh, read this guy. Oh, there's this stream of idea. There's this theology. Like, try this thing. For a whole bunch of years, as the church, like, through the medieval periods, almost like as a whole, like spirituality kind of disappears. And it's held in the monasteries. So like it survives those years of like warfare and witchcraft and the Dark Ages that are called dark for a reason. It's not because the sun disappeared. It's because like spiritually it was dark. And so the spiritual movements survive in the monasteries. So there's this whole idea that comes out of them that like, well, all that stuff is for monks, right? We don't do that stuff. Sure, the Desert Fathers wrote about it, but Benedict, he's like in a cave writing his Rule of Benedict. He's not writing it for me. He's writing it for the monks that would follow in his order. So there's this whole sense of like, no one's writing that for a whole chunk of years for your everyday follower of Jesus.
Yeah, there wasn't an expectation that the average follower of Jesus participated in any of that.
No, and even in the and this is like some of the conversations and challenges we see in a community like South. Even in the revival movements of like the 50s and stuff, like Billy Graham, like you're not seeing like an invite in discipleship afterwards towards like, have you thought about practicing solitude and silence? It's like read your Bible in the morning, pray in the morning, try and live out the ethics of Jesus.
Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch of those things that just get lost. And bizarrely, there's what you might call secular writers, quote marks, that are advocating for it, even when the church is saying nothing about it.
Yes. Does that mean that they're extra biblical? They're not biblical?
No, not at all. It just means they're a little hidden. Even like talking about Jesus as practicing silence is a tradition. It's not scriptural. There's nothing that says he did silence as almost like a meditation practice. They'll say things like Jesus went looking for solitude and Jesus went out to lonely places.
And he went away to pray.
Yeah, but the idea that he was looking for silence is something writers started saying like right around that time of the early church, but it's not like concretely there. Oh, and Jesus sat silently before God. Before his Father, like that. Now, what we do know is that there's a listening element to Jesus' prayer.
Yes, which
most spiritual writers would say only comes with choosing to be silent instead of choosing to talk. So I think it's biblical, but it's also interesting that there were loads of people that were advocating for that kind of space away from the hustle and bustle of life.
Yeah.
Before anyone in the church was really advocating for it.
Well, anyone in the general church, like God's global church, there's obviously, because the monasteries were part of it.
Yeah,
part
totally
of God's
right.
Church.
Yeah.
So,
but that anything outside of like the recluses was seen as weird, oddballs.
Yeah.
Like monks were seen as like, oh man, these are the extremes.
Yeah.
So they were,
and to some extent still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, even like we even talked about this in the Sermon on the Mount series, like all of the different ideas around the Sermon on the Mount. So amongst those ideas were, well, this is something for those people in monasteries and stuff to obey. People have time to obey all this stuff. Like no one's expecting everyday like Christians like you and me to enter into this.
Yeah. So there is a resurgence of a reintroduction of some spiritual disciplines and practices in recent years.
Definitely.
And I've noticed it in the church,
Definitely,
especially in the stream that maybe South would find itself.
Yeah. And it's a lot of it's like Richard Foster, it's Dallas Willard, it's some of these guys that like.
So what's the risk of the stream that we're in then? What's the risk? Like why might people like the spiritual discipline and spiritual practice conversation makes me nervous? What's
and I actually think like let's just say like there's a risk to losing any really of the traditions. So Richard Foster, who wrote a lot about spiritual disciplines, also wrote a book called Streams of Living Water, where he taps into like these different, like the charismatic stream, like the bibliocentric stream. Like he taps into these different streams that overlap. But his constant encouragement is don't lose any of those. But the evangelical church for a whole bunch of years really focused on study of scripture as its primary and perhaps only spiritual discipline or spiritual practice that it entered into.
Yeah.
With some prayer listing, perhaps, maybe some journaling or writing a diary or something like that, keeping a diary or something like that. But I think that, like anything, you can overemphasize it. Is it C.S. Lewis that says like it's always the novice that like goes extreme. It's never the master he learns from. Like the master he learns from is balanced and has all these different elements to it. And so like for someone like Dallas Willard, who deeply loves scripture and knows it like you wouldn't believe, who's deeply immersed in a prayer life that's beautiful and rich, who's living out the ethics of Jesus. And was it last week on the podcast we were talking about him in a class, like getting lit up by a student?
Yeah. And practicing the discipline of not having the last word.
Sure. Like, just beautiful.
Yeah.
So he enters into all these spiritual practices and he's like, yeah, these are just other things that I'm doing. Whereas the risk for the novice is you read something like Willard and you're like, okay, this is all I do now. Scripture's like pushed to the side. So there's the risk. Like, you start hearing about other spiritual disciplines and you leave the old things that you've been doing behind. And that's
and I think the critique I've heard of some of even of Willard, of some of these folks is works righteousness.
Sure. Yeah.
There's this theological tradition that talks about salvation by grace through faith. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. We don't earn our salvation, and on and on and on and on. And then when you start talking about disciplines and practices and these different things that are expected of followers of Jesus or assist followers of Jesus to follow in his way, they feel very works-like. It's a list of things to do. Do solitude and silence. This entire series is a list of things to do.
Yeah.
And so it starts to be like, are we earning our salvation again?
Well, which is interesting because you would say the same about the reading of scripture, right? Like, it's like...
Well, no, that one doesn't count. Because that one's like the one that we were told when we were littler.
That's maybe the challenge, right? And that, like, that idea that we're saved by grace is a beautiful truth that now is like, I mean, the Catholic Church, I think it was 96, came out and said, like, we can say categorically based on scripture that salvation is by faith alone in Jesus alone. Like that shift, even amongst the Catholic Church, like, they would say the protest is over, guys. Like, yeah, come home. Like, we're on the same page. Back to the real church. Yeah. So there's like that's just locked in for most churches now, most streams. Like, that's the rescue. That's the redemption. And yet there seems concrete evidence throughout the New Testament that we're going to become more like Jesus. And that Paul's pretty clear that happens through things like spirit. There's some effort to that, even if there's not some earning to that, to use that very Willardian language. Willardian language.
I don't know.
That grace isn't opposed to effort, it's opposed to earning.
Yeah.
So I think that, like, that shift to, like,
and that's the weird tension of maturation in the way of Jesus is oftentimes the overwhelming goodness of our introduction to faith. We are swept up by God's unmerited favor, his grace. And we're shocked that he could love such as we. And then it's like, oh, and, you know, it's Romans 5, while we were still sinners, while we were enemies of God, you know, all that stuff. And you're sort of ushered into the faith there. And then as you proceed into the rest of the implications of being a follower of Jesus, you start to see all these things that we're supposed to be doing and participating in and all this stuff. And it's like, wait, so how does this work where we don't earn anything and yet we're supposed to be good to the poor and we're supposed to pray and have solitude and all this, like which ones are rules, which one aren't rules? And maturity in the way of Jesus is this figuring out that you don't earn, but that there are things to be had in the way of Jesus, and even expectations that you should be doing X, Y, Z if you are a follower of Jesus.
Well, even like this week will like change direction a little bit. The spiritual discipline we'll focus on is gratitude. Like, so gratitude is simply a reminding yourself of what God has done, or God's goodness in his creation and his gift of life to you. To a degree, like, you might say, well, why should I have to practice gratitude? And in reality, like, we practice gratitude because we know we're prone to forget. Lord Cromwell, who was Lord Protector of England during the Civil War back in like 16 1650 or something. That's before. Before 1776.
That is.
Yeah.
That's how that works.
Yeah. So his last prayer was, God, you know that I'm going to be awful. This is like in the last battle where he ends up dying. He says, God, you know that I'll be busy today and may forget you. Please, oh God, do not forget me. Which is a fascinating prayer because on one hand, it acknowledges like our proneness to forget, but like throughout scripture, it isn't God that forgets, it's us that forget. Like he doesn't forget us. It's the same prayer in Lamentations chapter 5, like God, oh, remember us. But we're the ones that forget, he doesn't forget. So like gratitude is a practice of reminding ourselves of the goodness of God. And reminding ourselves of what he has done.
It's super interesting to me that so much of Christianity, living in the way of Jesus, trying to stay in step with Jesus, whatever you want to call it, it involves waging war against some of our natural inclinations as human beings.
Yeah.
Which feels super frustrating sometimes.
And that some of our natural inclinations are at war with God's work in us.
Yes. So like our very physiology and our brains are wired to retain dangerous and harmful things more than wonderful, beautiful things.
Yeah.
Because we're trying to mitigate risk. We're trying to find safety, security, and stuff. Like biologically, like we're wired to retain risky things and remember dangers and meditate on them and preemptively plan against dangerous things.
Yeah.
And so as a result, we spend a lot of our times thinking about the bad stuff.
Yeah.
And then a spiritual practice of gratitude is to slow down and force yourself to do something that your physiology isn't naturally going to do.
Yeah, bad experiences are like Velcro and good experiences are like Teflon.
Yeah.
Like one sticks and the other, like actually, unless you practice it.
Yeah.
So
and they both cause cancer.
Velcro? Is Velcro a bad thing? I missed that one. You never know, do you?
If you eat it.
Good old innocent Velcro sitting there all these years on my shoes and stuff. So I just think that, that whole level of development is fascinating. Max Lucado told a story years ago in one of his books where he tried to give an example of the difference between like the positional sanctification and righteousness that came in life with Jesus versus the progressive shift or sanctification that happens over years of following him. And he comes up with this brilliant example of him playing golf in a pro-am tournament where like there's a pro golfer who has a team of other golfers that play with him. And he said it's all scored by like the best score of the group. And so he said like there's me like shanking balls off the tee into the water and like just causing chaos out there. And he said, like, for the first, like, however many holes, I didn't contribute a thing. Like, there was nothing of me in there. And he said, but as we're going around, like, this pro that I'm playing with is, like, fixing my grip, and he's helping me with shots, and, like, he's just, like, developing me. And like, towards the end of the round, I just caught this perfect shot off a tee, and the ball lands, like, right in the middle of the green or something, and we put out for a 2, and my score was the one that contributed. All through the work of this coach that's brought transformation to his golf game.
Wow.
I'm like, that's such a great picture of the work of Jesus in you that actually you start to develop and grow and change. Now I think that maybe the example like falls short in that ultimately like there's probably nothing we contribute of ourselves in the spiritual game, but it does give a picture of the growth in us.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was just meeting with my sort of worship leader team, and we were kind of sort of joking and seriously sort of contemplating how little control we actually have over a worship culture and a worship gathering. Like we can plan, we can get all of our transition right and pick the songs that everyone knows and loves and like all this preparation and planning and like the power could go out.
Yeah.
And like, or some sort of tech issue happens, or a band member doesn't show up prepared. And so like you're banking on them hitting that transition and they're not ready. And then honestly, like the congregation carries 80% of the weight of whether a worship gathering feels good.
Yeah.
80%.
Yeah.
The congregation carries, and whether if they come ready to worship, if a follower of Jesus shows up into a space, come ready to worship Jesus, there's nothing we can do to prevent them from worshiping Jesus.
Isn't that so fascinating, right?
And if they don't come ready to worship Jesus, there's nothing we can do to force them to worship.
Totally. There was this guy years ago, a worship pastor, that did a sermon on like worship culture. And he's talking about like the work they put in and the practice sessions. And he has another guy like who's preaching with him, and that guy like goes over to like the drums and starts like playing like this standard like beat of like, and it's just like, you know, and then he's got that like this like little like bass line or something like that. It's just like you can feel it, and you got these two elements, and he's like, every week, like this is us in practice. There's something there, you can feel it. There's something that makes sense. He says, then every week that engages with you guys as a community, and this is what happens. And this guy gets on the guitar and he plays like the top line from Superstition, where it just like has that super funky like,
yeah.
And he kind of says at the end, he says like, every week we're the bass and the drums, but you guys are Superstition. Like it's like a different, like there's a different thing that happens when a group of people come to worship.
Yeah. But the point is,
they cannot, right? Yeah.
The point is, the Spirit moves and he does his thing, and like we just show up. It's like we're like that golfer, right?
Yeah.
It's like we're throwing in our efforts and stuff, and he's like, oh yeah, I'll do all the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
But so I had this. So one other question, kind of in this space, and then I'd love to move back towards silence and solitude.
Solitude and silence.
Solitude and silence. Sorry. I heard on a podcast today, someone said unconditional grace, and the other person in the show was like, no, I don't like that terminology because it is absolutely conditional. And I was like, oh, he said, I like unconditioned grace because when we first receive the grace of God, it's unconditioned. But it doesn't mean there's no conditions going forward. Like once you're enter into the system of faith, there are lots of conditions in order to not maintain your salvation or anything like that, but to actually participate in the kingdom of God. There are conditions for you to participate. What do you think about that?
Well, I think so. I do think there's this trend, and I didn't hear the podcast, so I think there's this trend suddenly with people to believe, because they throw in a slightly different word or say it in a particular way, that they've solved like centuries of theological conversation. Like,
fair enough.
There was a guy I heard the other day who...
Should I tell you who it was who said it?
Yeah.
And then no, never mind. Go carry on.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you later.
So there was this guy the other day who I was listening to. It was just a reel that came up, and he was preaching, and he was clearly talking about like the free will of salvation element, or the election perspective of salvation. And he reads this thing, and he's like, you know, all of the centuries of argument melt under the plain words of Jesus. Then he reads this passage. And I'm like, just because you threw melt in and said it in a particular way, you didn't solve the conversation. That you could have read a different saying of Jesus and said, all of the arguments melt under the plain words of Jesus. So I think there's this shift to like throwing in a particular way of saying things, or throwing in like the tweak between conditioned or unconditioned, or what was the other term?
Unconditional.
Unconditional. And says like, that solves it.
Yeah.
There's plenty of things that Jesus said that you might look at and say, that sounds like you're saying that, like, no one will take him from my Father's hand. Like, sounds like you got it. And then there's other things that seem to emphasize the opposite. And I think we just have to grow comfortable with that tension, right? Yeah. So I don't feel like he's ended the 2,000-year debate between Calvinists and Arminianists or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so like solitude and silence. Why is that so significant? Maybe in our generation. Is it a generational thing? Is this maybe a more powerful spiritual practice?
Ooh, that would make sense to me, right?
Given our current generation than it was in the past.
Well, I do think, like, what's the curve that people talk about? Like there's like is it like there's this sudden like mass increase of like informational whatever. It's not S curve, because S curve is where it plateaus and comes around the other side. But there's some like. Is it something to do with like singularity or something like that? I can't remember, but there's some kind of like exponential
parabolic.
Yeah, maybe that's
growth. Yeah,
where it suddenly like turns a corner. So I was reading as I was prepping for Solitude and Silence, some excerpts of the book Papillon, which was written by a guy called Henri Charrière, like back in the 19th century, early 20th century. He was a rich guy in France that got convicted of murder and put in solitary confinement in some of the prisons that France held in South America, like French Guiana, all those regions.
Okay.
And he comes out of solitary confinement, like after 2 years of almost going insane with like no conversation whatsoever. And I think he keeps saying because some friends smuggle him in some cigarettes and stuff like that just to break up the monotony of the day. And so he comes back and he writes this book and he says something like the modern world is increasingly trying to produce things to make life easier and better. And yet all of these things constantly like shift life, like goes into this kind of like semi-rant about like life is just becoming unlivable. He wrote this in 1963. So you're like, what would you think if you landed in 2024, 25? Like, because the curve has just shifted again. Like, really what he's bemoaning in 1963 is like color TV. And some of like these earlier attempts at things like the video recorder or the cassette reel or something like that. The mass production of books. You know, you're kind of like, what was your angst in 1963? Because that feels like so much slower in pace. And now we're here in 2024 where, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Like everything has to be instant, like instant gratification of everything. So I would definitely say, given the world we experience, those practices are so much more transformative than they've ever been before.
So how does it work? What's actually happening in our souls when we get away and find solitude and silence?
So on a weird level, you are committing to a space where you're not constantly trying to meet the needs of others and fulfill a function in society. I mean, just on a broad level, that's a gift. It's actually a bizarre thing that because most of us run at this absurd pace, even if we don't know it.
Yeah.
There was a doctor who worked with patients that were delivered a life-threatening diagnosis. And he said the number one characteristic of all of them was relief. Okay, I get to stop. Like, this is changing everything. Like, it thrust something into the middle of their life that said, okay, no one's expecting me to do this right now. And he said it was so interesting to him because it wasn't that anything changed about their energy levels instantly or even about their ability to function instantly, but it felt like it gave them permission to stop. And solitude is supposed to give you permission to stop. It's supposed to say to you, carve out this window where you're not constantly, someone else is holding those burdens for you. If you're married, it's like a deal perhaps that says, I'm going to go and do this at this point and you're going to go and do it at another point.
Yeah.
But on the surface, it's just simply like, when you go to Sacred Heart, like someone has a meal ready for you.
Yeah.
You didn't have to answer that everyday question that you have when you have kids of like, what are we going to feed them today?
Yep.
Like, you didn't have to stand there and cook that food in the midst of like all those, like, all of that suddenly for a moment is just, you're free of that.
Yeah. I've scheduled a silent retreat a couple days ago, and I had the option of going up to a cabin or going to Sacred Heart. And I decided to go to Sacred Heart mainly for the meal thing.
Sure. I had the same option and I made the same choice.
And that sounds like a strange thing but it carries it carries a ton of weight for that to be dealt with, because you don't even have that question. There's no obligation even to care for your own body.
Yeah, so there's that piece. And then there's the other shift with somewhere like Sacred Heart is the cabin is a beautiful gift. It's probably a beautiful place.
Yep.
But it's a place of like family games and fun and celebration, perhaps. It's a game of perhaps family arguments. It's a place of vacation as opposed to work. It's got all of this kind of like working history in the building of like, this is what it's for.
Yep.
Whereas when you go to somewhere like Sacred Heart, you're like, this is a place that's been devoted to the spiritual life for as long as it's been there. Yeah. It has no other purpose other than that. So when you walk through the door, you don't walk into like a wondering about, I wonder when this family will last here, or wonder when this couple that own it will last here, or wonder when, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
You walk into, okay, I'm in a place that's designed just for this.
Yeah.
That's a special thing.
It is. So you just summarize this idea of you're not needed. Mm-hmm. No one's demanding something of you. So there's like a pressure that comes off the shoulders.
And then no one thinks anything of you.
So talk about that.
Yeah. So they don't, you don't matter. Like, and South.
Why is that a good thing? Why is that a beautiful gift?
Well, I think any function in a church, especially, messes with your identity. I mean, even just think like South is like a medium-sized church by definition, somewhere like 500, 600 people. I think the definition of a large church now is 500 people. So somewhere like in that gap.
Yeah.
So for me, like every week or most weeks, a whole bunch of people sit in silence and listen to me talk for 40 minutes.
Yeah.
There's no other job that does that. Like it doesn't exist. Like, sure, you might go hear a comedian once a year,
or a news,
or listen to a news person like riff, but in the same way of like devoted monologue. Now you could sit with a really critical attitude, sure, but you're still sitting there, still silent in the face. So that does something to you. That's a level of like acknowledgement, or I guess respect on some level that most people don't get in their lives. So just like if power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. Like everything about a role in a spiritual community has the potential to bring toxicity to your life.
Yeah, I get that, and maybe folks are out there listening. They're like, yeah, but I don't do that. So why should I do spiritual solitude?
And yet you still live in a world where people think something of you based on what you do, whether it's you're a father of kids or a father of grown-up kids, or respected in your friend group for such and such a thing, or valued because you're the guy that picks up the check every now and again, or like life is a complex social network of like, what's the term I'm looking for? Of competition.
Yeah.
Of comparison. That's the Ecclesiastes idea, right? Of like all human suffering, toil, misery is based on one man's comparison of another. So if you're ever, and you are, even if you don't know you are, I would suggest it takes a super well-formed person to get beyond any of this. And I've never met anyone that I'm like, you have no sense of like, I've not a single person, even though I've met some great people who have lots of elements to it. I have not met a single person in 40 years of living who has hit that point of you don't ever compare yourself to anyone, as far as I can tell. And this is just what I see on the surface, not even what's beneath. In a place like Sacred Heart or a place of solitude, it all disappears.
Yeah.
You realize that it's pointless. It's flawed. Yeah.
So, and then in that void, so you take away some of the false identities that we naturally form. Let's say you're an accountant, and one of the things you draw your identity from is you're the one that never makes a mistake.
Uh-huh.
That's part of who you like to think of yourself as. Or maybe you're an accountant and you're the life of the office. Everyone else is sort of quiet and stingy, but you actually bring a joyful place to the office.
Suddenly got
so
loads of parks and rec moments in my
you're the personality in the office that makes people they're all heads down doing their accounting stuff, and so do you. But the other thing you do and the place you draw your identity from is you're the one who makes the office tolerable. Or let's say you're an accountant and you hate your job, but you like to be known as the one who hates their job because they're dying to get home and be that amazing father. Yeah. And you invest in your kids. Either way, all of those places are places you draw your identity from. And when you suck those places of identity from, you find out that guess what? You are valuable because you're made in the image of God and God values you.
Yeah.
There's nothing else, nothing more, nothing less.
There's a quote, I can't, I think it's another Count of Monte Cristo quote. And there's this scene in the Count of Monte Cristo where 3 of the characters are watching an execution. And the Count says something like, only in death does a man finally remove the mask he's worn the entirety of his life and show his true self to the world. And I'm like, that's so interesting. Like, just suddenly in that final moment, like, you might reveal something like that, like, oh, wait, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
And I think, like, whether that part is true, certainly the like, do you remember the movie The Mask? Jim Carrey?
Yeah.
And as the psychiatrist that he goes to meet and is like, they're talking back and forth about, like, identity and stuff. And he's like, well, we all wear masks, metaphorically speaking. And it's such a stupid way of saying it, but we do.
Yeah.
Like we hide behind like a persona almost, I think. And so I think solitude, like, it makes you realize, oh, what's the point of that when you're in front of a God who sees every aspect of you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's a gift. And then if you can couple that with the silence element of trying to shut down or quieten the machine, the cogs that are constantly whirring. I'm told this is more noticeable in women than men. I was actually reading like a bunch of psychological reports. This guy who was like, he's in a newspaper in England called The Telegraph, and he does these whole like series of stuff like what like your husband wishes you knew about his brain, or what your wife wishes you knew about her brain, or like male female divides. And he says one of like, after 30 years of psychology, he said one of the things I'm completely convinced about is if a woman could get into a man's brain for a day, she'd be amazed at how comparatively quiet it is. Like, men are more adept at compartmentalizing, shutting off, like, I can't do anything about that right now, I'm going to put it to a side.
Yeah.
So it sits over there just unobserved. Like the counter, like, advantage to that is men tend to disassociate from their mothers quicker. So like they come out somewhat emotionally stunted, whereas girls tend to stay emotionally connected for their mother for longer. So men are less adept at intimacy in relationship because they don't, like, they have a whole bunch of like sense of like uncertainty and insecurity in it.
Yeah.
So there's like, it's not like good or bad. It's just like,
just how it
just forming. Work, yeah. And so on a general level, because I feel like my brain's pretty busy, to be honest.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm kind of lost in the whirlwind a lot.
Yeah.
But maybe I don't even know like what it could be like. Who knows? Like, I don't have any comparison. But somewhere that constant like turning of the cogs, somewhere it's supposed to slow down.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that I found that solitude does, and I noticed this a little bit on silent retreats, but I noticed it the most when I did 8 weeks of vocal rest.
Oh, yeah.
Where I wasn't secluded, but I couldn't contribute with my voice. It's my prayer life just skyrocketed because no one else can hear you. Yeah. And so when you do get a place that is quiet, no one cares, and no one's listening except God. And you find out, oh, that's right. He's always listening. And so you can just, the only person you can process with, the only person you can engage with is the Lord. And so strangely, turning down the volume of all of your own speech and other people's speech around you actually might turn up the volume of both listening and speaking to God.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's like a good, like, communication clearing way of practicing prayer, where it just, oh, that's right, you're here, I can talk to you this way. And that tends to carry for me into the weeks and months following. I feel like the dividends of a silent retreat or a silent season, they start to really come to fruition, not just during it, but in the weeks and months that follow.
And so one of the things, if you're kind of listening and you're like, I just don't know if I can do that, like Sacred Heart, for example, you can go and do that silent retreat directed, is what it's called. So you can sit with a spiritual director, and they actually like prep to have that conversation with you. They're praying for you, like they know in advance you're coming, and they actually are listening for God with you.
Yeah.
Which is just a gift when you have someone who like...
Did you do directed this last time?
I did not, no. Okay. I was thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I kind of booked late because I'd known I was going, but for some reason I never got around to booking. And so I'd been like, well, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
But it is this like, yes, this window into someone else who's involved in that conversation. They might give you a thing to meditate on, to think over, to read, like a passage of scripture to keep coming back to. But that's like maybe a jump-in point if you're like, to be honest, like 48 hours by myself terrifies me. I felt that way first time. I drove into Sacred Heart with trepidation of soul the first time. And I kind of put my stuff in my room, and I had that moment where I was just like, huh. And what do I do now? I don't really have anything. So I think I fell asleep.
Yeah.
I think I just...
That's usually the first thing that happens. And I think I was fortunate enough to have read some Dallas Willard about solitude and silence prior to doing my first silent retreat. And he talks about sleep in, I don't remember which one of his books, but he was like, yeah, like most of the time I fall asleep. That's okay. That's part of it. Like I found out when I took my first silent retreat how exhausted I actually was. I think I told you my first time I slept. So I wanted to like hear God's voice. And so I sat and I read my Bible for a bit. Again, I'm striving, trying to produce something, trying to make sure that I capitalized on this season. My family gave me permission to go. I better come out a transformed man, though. I got to earn. I still got, like all that stuff. And just sitting in the silence that night, I went to dinner. I came back. I just could not stay awake. And I'm like, well, okay. So I climbed into bed. I slept for 14 hours.
That's nuts.
And then I got up, went to breakfast, went back to my room and slept for another 4 hours. And I struggle to stay awake when I read. I just can't stay awake. And then once I finished that process of like a 14-hour stint followed by a 4-hour stint, I woke up and sat in a chair and read this formation book for 8 solid hours without effort.
Yes.
And I was like, that's the first time I've ever been able to read all day and stay awake.
Yeah.
And I was like, is this what it's like to actually be awake?
Yeah, maybe.
I had not experienced that maybe since I was like 8 years old.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is what it's like to actually have a body that is actually rested.
So I don't know about you.
I was shocked.
I don't know about you, but I'm always somewhat envious of people going for the first time to something like this.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's ever quite the same. It's always good, but there's something about the way it catches you off guard the first time. Like I still remember like driving out of this place the first time. And I pulled into a gas station and this lady's like, I'm so sorry, like something's gone wrong with like, we're trying to figure out this like system of like payment and we hope it'll be back up in a few minutes. I'm like, it's fine. Like,
everything. Who cares?
Don't take your time. Like there's no rush on anything ever.
That's great.
Like everything in me was just at such peace and harmony.
Now, I think, so I did a 3-day stint, and then maybe 6 months later, I went on sabbatical and did 7 days.
Yeah.
And actually, that sleep thing didn't happen on the 7-day retreat. And since then, I still tend to rest a lot that first day. It's like a detox thing, but it doesn't happen as much. But what I've noticed is I don't let myself get that tired anymore.
Yeah.
And part of the result of it, part of the result of experience true rest physically and emotionally and spiritually is that I was like, oh, this was something God had for me all along. And I've been pushing too hard because I'm trying to get my identity from everything else. And so now my everyday life has a little bit more rest in it because of the silent retreat.
Yeah. So, yeah. Spot on.
Anyway, what else? We didn't get a question this week.
Yeah, briefly, like silence. I think there's maybe a couple more things to say. Like solitude. I feel like there's ways that the world outside church has weirdly championed the power of silence a little bit more. Like, so a couple of examples. 1993 Super Bowl show. Like the year before, they've done like this weird like choir thing with like children of the area, and like they look at the TV metrics, and like 90% of the population turns to a different channel during the Super Bowl halftime show. Like nobody's watching. And so like they're like, this is a problem. Like all our commercial revenue like could be amazing if we could keep people watching. Like what do we do? So the next year they hire Michael Jackson. And Michael Jackson does this thing like that he's done throughout his, I think it's the Dangerous tour, where like he pops up out of the stage and he lands on the stage and then he just doesn't move for like 90 seconds. I think in the tour it's actually longer. I think it stretches out. And there's this weird shift of like in people's minds are like, wait, hold on, this is the most valuable moments in television throughout the year. Like the cost for this show is huge. The cost for the advertising revenue is ginormous. Like who's wasting it with silence? Like what's wrong with you? And yet like years later, people remember that when they don't remember any of the set list. They don't remember anything else about the performance. It stands out when Tiger Woods wins the 2019 Masters. The commentator tells the guys that he's commentating with, okay, when this putt goes in, no one's talking until I talk again. Like, because they're done, like one of them's at the 18th green and one of them's in like the cabin and one of them's like in the studio. And he's like, it's just, I'm the one that talks next. And he leaves it like 4.5 minutes without talking as these scenes just play. And everyone like, afterwards is just like, that was amazing. Like, how did you know to do that? And he said, my first mentor in television told me, use silence as a weapon. Your first like instinct as a commentator will be, you got to fill every moment with talking.
Yeah.
And he said, and then you realize there's some moments that actually talking, it damages. So actually, like, again, like more modern example, when the Queen of England died in 2022, there's a couple of different recordings of that. One was by a newspaper who were there was one feed, one like video feed. One was a newspaper, and there's constant chatter about they're going to sing this hymn now, they're going to do this now, and they're going to do this now. And it's awful. It's unwatchable. And then there's another one where nobody talks for most of the broadcast. They just let the moment speak for itself, and it's just magical.
Yeah.
So like somewhere there's this idea that like our constant chatter and talking, it kind of like it ruins moments. And I say that as a person who has had to learn to embrace awkward silences with people a little bit, like in counseling sessions and stuff. My tendency will be to want people to feel at their ease.
Yeah.
So I'll talk, so they don't have to think about what to say.
Yeah.
But then you realize really quickly in a counseling setting, Now that's part of the work for them. They need to have that space in order to wrestle process with what to say, what to bring.
Yeah. And we tried to like mimic that in a very short way on Sunday during that song, where we have this song that's really peppy.
Yeah.
And it says, the same voice that spoke to the rose to make it unfold spoke to me here in my chest. So be quiet now. And I don't know how people experience that out there, but we actually, for the band, we shut off all of the band. Like the band just breaks off. It goes to the acoustic guitar, and then I repeated it a couple times, and then I stopped repeating it and held for just a second, and then the guitar starts playing back up, and then the next phrase is da da da. It's like a snare drum roll with a bunch of other stuff going on really fast, and I don't know how people experience that, but that's actually one of the things that makes music powerful is the negative space between. And then another song that we did that on with Sunday is that song we've been doing recently called Need You More, because it's like the drum beat goes like this. Doom.
Doom. So it's got that space for one instrument at least.
Yeah, and then the rest of the band, the piano part on that song is like a 3-note arpeggio. The entire song, like ding 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 ding. That's all the piano plays for the entire song, and then the first electric guitar plays a few like very light finger picking things, like ding 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 ding. And then musically, like, okay, aside from the spiritual implications of what we're singing as a congregation, musically, what sells that song is then you have a slide electric guitar that fits in the gaps. That just sings. It almost sounds like a crying tone. So one of the things that make violins and string sections so powerful, or a slide guitar so powerful, is it mimics the tone of someone weeping.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
So the tonal quality of a violin is almost like someone wailing.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why strings are used even in the most modern movies for the soundtracks, is a string section sounds like human voices weeping almost.
Well, I once heard that the cello is the instrument that most mimics the human voice. Its tones.
Yeah.
Like land in that very like human like range or whatever. I think like this, and you start to see like all of this idea connect across so many different things in a script for a play or a movie. You'll like see people either write in or it'll even be in the text, like beat. Like there's just like this idea that no one sentence doesn't follow on straight away from another sentence. Like somewhere you don't respond instantly. There's a pause.
Yeah.
That says like there's a gap, and then someone responds.
Yeah.
And somewhere, like to me, silence is that beat between you saying a lot of the things that you need to say. And sometimes those things are like joyful things like praise or thanksgiving, or like, and we'll talk about again that somewhat this week. And sometimes they're more like angsty, like imprecatory, like God, where are you in this? I think is it Psalm 73 that the modern translation is something literally like, God, take your hand out of your pocket. Like what are you doing? And then there's a beat between like where you just stop. There's maybe nothing to say in that moment. Yeah. And then maybe God speaks. I think that's all the time in Job. There's like finally this moment where Job's just like, okay,
I'm done.
Yeah. I got it.
And it's in art, it's in typography, negative space in a painting, and the negative space of a painting is just as powerful and important as the positive space. Yeah. And on and on and on and on and on. And so the question for you maybe is, as you ponder maybe trying out a practice of silence or solitude silence, however you want to refer to it, is Do you want your life to be a really bad song or really bad piece of art that is filled edge to edge, or an unbearable page of literature that is edge to edge without any margins? Or do you want to create margins so that your life can be at peace? And even those who look upon your life can actually see the beauty. Yeah. And if there's no negative space in your life, it is just a chaotic mess of a something, you know, to look at or listen to.
A couple of things to say there to make sure, like, people don't go away with this sense of like this just I wish
guilt and shame, shame and guilt.
And so I have this like weird like belief that I don't have grounded in anything other than experience. That when time is limited, God honors time given in surprising ways. I was like probably 20. I was doing some leadership stuff for like youth ministry stuff. And it was a weird time because I was probably a little too close in age to some of the oldest kids. So there's maybe like 2 years between some of us. And we were kind of like in that camp setting where life is just like busy. You get up at like 7 o'clock in the morning, you go to bed at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and you just go. And during that time, I think I had like 15 minutes that they gave me to take a break to say like, okay, you don't have anything scheduled right now.
Yeah.
And I went into this 17th century chapel, like this old little place on the coast of Wales, like just like stained glass windows and just smells of old prayers. And I just put on a song and got down on my knees. And I'd been in a season where I'd been working like maybe 20 hours a week before that. I was in a break between college and degree. And I had been praying a lot, been putting a lot of time aside for that kind of thing. And it was good. It was great at times. But this 15 minutes of just coming before God and just listening to some music and bringing like the broken bits of my heart, it was like God's presence flooded in a way that I hadn't experienced for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And I was like, wait, how is it like this? When I literally like was like, I got 5 minutes really. Yeah. Once I got there and once, I had to go back.
Yep.
And it hit me that, oh no, like here, this is like a widow's mite parable in a different application. Like you're giving everything you have, not giving some out of your hours and hours of freedom.
Yep.
And I was just been aware of that ever since. So if you're in a season of life, like both of us really, where life is just like tip to tail busy.
Yep.
Like it's just constantly going. I think I did a video of this at South the last time I preached on silence, where I kind of typed the intro.
Yeah.
And then recorded the typing. And at one point I said something like, in my life, there is no silence, there is only trolls. Because my kids were into that Trolls TV show. So everything, it just exemplified the constant noise of the house.
Yeah.
And the busyness of life. You will have to work to find any space for this. You'll have to negotiate with spouse over like, maybe you go one weekend, I go the other weekend, and we work to cover each other's absence. And it's going to cost and it's going to enrich.
Yep.
It's not going to be an easy thing to navigate.
Yeah, and the beauty of like this, both the Spirit of God and the way He made the human soul is that your soul is like, it's so quiet. It's not going to shout at you, I need a little bit of time and space. It'll be drowned out by the chaos of life and the obligations of other people and all that stuff. It's just going to be this quiet thing. And it may grow super unhealthy, but it doesn't speak very loudly. But it's also beautiful because it's like a sponge. Every little nugget of spiritual nutrients that you give the soul produces tenfold.
Yeah.
And so like that 15 minutes is like, imagine this dry sponge that's been overtaxed of a soul. and you just drip a few drops of water and it just like absorbs that. Yeah. And then that sustenance can then sustain you for the next season.
This is the interesting thing about that, like to take that metaphor of a sponge. And this is why like it might surprise you, like one, how gracious God is at times, and two, like how it may take some time to get to those spaces. Have you ever like taken a dry sponge and just set it on top of water? It'll just sit there for hours. Doesn't sink in.
Huh.
It's like if it's so dry, it can't, like it has to sit there, and then slowly the water will seep in. If you push that sponge underwater and like let it soak and squeeze the water out and put it back on the top, it'll instantly drop into the water.
Yeah.
Like it's ready.
Like a semi-damp sponge grabs it.
Yeah. And so like maybe there's this beautiful gift that God in his grace says, like, when you turn up to these places, I see you like this semi-damp sponge that longs for more of my presence. Maybe it's like the initial dunk into water of that sponge that, like, if you're coming to services and like, why is it that it's just hard for me to enter in? Maybe solitude and silence is that real dunk of a sponge underwater that preps you for those.
That's good. Well, there's the invitation. Hopefully we did a good sales pitch for you. We recommend it. We give it 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. You should try it. We love y'all. Tune in next week as we talk a little bit about gratitude and the power of that. And with that note,